Yes, thanks.
We're like the mini panel.
Yeah.
It is, and I'm attentive to that too.
But you know what? No one's really talked about mitigation much. That's
Well, now's your time.
title.
I'll
That's,
yeah. Jim led into it pretty darn well there. So.
Yeah, I thought so too.
yeah.
Nada, Brett Dumas, nice to meet you in person.
Okay.
Thanks for asking.
Oh yeah, I can butcher them. All right. So if you'll notice, I am attentive to the time of day. I know what the energy levels happen at the end of a long day, and we have 3 panelists up here, not 4, because unfortunately Kyle Tackett cannot be with us because of I believe there was a death in his family that he unfortunately had to respond to. And so I'll introduce our panelists in a minute, but and we'll do this like any other panel. We'll do the questions and so forth, but I did urge Zach to see if the post-conference activities could be teed up to start earlier if need be, so we don't have a dead time after it with, you know, kind of waiting around and so forth. So this final panel, Roundtable 5, and it obviously very important, landscape level conservation and incentivizing private landowners, which is so important. We have 3 panelists, Nada Culver from the Wilderness Society. She's the Senior Director of Agency Policy and Planning. We have Brett Dumas, Environmental Supervisor for Idaho Power Company. And then Wyatt Prescott, the Executive Vice President of the Idaho Cattle Association. So with that, Nada, we'll turn it over to you and just go 1, 2, 3, and then like we've been doing all day.
Not to be difficult, but could I have my PowerPoint? Just click it. Okay, great. So far, so good. My name is Nada Culver. I work at the Wilderness Society in Denver. I direct something called the BLM Action Center. So we work on BLM lands west-wide. And the Wilderness Society was founded in 1935. So before there was a Wilderness Act, before there was a big W, wilderness. We're all about public lands and responsible management and protecting wild places. So our mission is to protect wilderness, but also, second part, inspire Americans to care about our wild places. So we get into landscape level planning, especially when it's directed by the federal government, obviously, because of public lands. So I'm going to talk about our engagement in landscape level planning, but also how it has led to our awareness and involvement with private landowners and incentivizing. So just a reminder, we're not talking about this landscape level planning, which is not as exciting, landscaping your backyard, but big landscape level planning. And excuse me, we engage in that because it means looking across artificial boundaries. You can have a bigger vision than you might with a smaller planning area. So going beyond BLM field offices, but that does mean impacting other land managers and private lands. But overall, we think it's more important to operate at the landscape level because you can then gather as much information as you need to sustain multiple uses and resources on this bigger landscape, and to get to a better balance, honestly, between conservation and other multiple uses. The other part of landscape level planning that is really important for us is more opportunity for public input. This gives us a chance to be more collaborative, means the agency is inventorying, evaluating, planning, and managing the landscape in consultation and conjunction with the public and stakeholders at every aspect of the process. So this should allow the public and stakeholders to shape the plan up front rather than responding later on to proposals that haven't been widely vetted with them. The theory being more input should get us to a better solution, but also to one that's better accepted. So a couple of examples and lessons learned. Heard a lot about the greater sage grouse today. For the Wilderness Society, we engaged because we care deeply about the sagebrush ecosystem, working on BLM lands across the West. And the process was driven in large part by the Endangered Species Act. The management decisions on the table were going to affect hundreds of species and uses. So this is just a short list from the Federal Register of everything that was being considered in terms of uses that would be managed by these SageGrouse plans. And the kitchen sink should have been in there, but you can see what happened. And, you know, in Colorado, the way this worked, BLM reached out to the state, to the counties, to conservationists, to industry, and we all felt like we were having a chance to craft the plan. And obviously, there were changes along the way that were somewhat hard to accept for some of the parties, but in the end, we felt that it was workable. And you know, everyone has stayed at the table. BLM has continued to roll out the plans. The private landowners that are working to participate in the Colorado Habitat Exchange we're trying to get started are all still at the table and interested in making this work. You know, are the plans perfect? No. Are they better than what we had before? And should we give them a chance to work? Yes. Just to change species, Gunnison sage-grouse. So for those of you who haven't met this species, it's kind of the bad haircut cousin of the greater sage-grouse. It's got kind of an 80s do going on, I think. And it's a lot smaller population. It's 11 counties in Colorado and Utah. Only 40% of the habitat compared to the greater sage-grouse is on federal land. What happened with the Gunnison sage-grouse was that the state and the counties felt like they were making significant efforts. There was a state plan, there was a lot of easements that had been put in place, and they believed they were responding to Fish and Wildlife Service concerns, and at the same time, the BLM was just beginning their programmatic EIS, so not in a place like the greater sage-grouse, so a little bit further behind. A number of entities were trying to find a way to get a solution in place. Again, it was more challenging. The BLM plan had just kicked off. There's not even a draft out still. And there were some new concerns raised by Fish and Wildlife Service, but a number of conservation groups are working with the Gunnison County, who leads this effort, the state of Colorado, the BLM, and the Fish and Wildlife Service. And unfortunately, we ran out of time. As was mentioned, there are some timelines here for getting decisions made, and we ran out of time. That said, everybody is continuing to work. Even after this decision was made, the Fish and Wildlife Service decided to list the Gunnison sage-grouse as threatened. They were promptly sued by the state of Colorado, joined by Gunnison County, as well as some other wildlife groups who didn't like the decision either. That said, the BLM is still moving forward on their plan. Everyone is participating. Conservation easements are continuing to be negotiated around those 11 counties. BLM is still at the table, NRCS has come to the table, and all the counties are still at the table. So I think we're hoping to keep working there and see how we can make this process work as we finalize the BLM plan. And then just to switch geography for a minute, this is the Desert Renewable Energy Conservation Plan. This plan covers 22 million acres in Southern California in the desert. And it's an interesting mix. I know you can't see all the colors, but basically the yellow and the green and the big blotches there on the northeastern are all federal, but you can see the blue dots are state land and all the gray is private. And the concept here was driven by the desert tortoise and other federal and state special status species. But what got mixed in was the federal and state commitments to develop renewable energy on these lands, both California and federal commitments. And so what happened is decided to plan for solar, plan for wind, plan for geothermal. Now we need to plan for transmission. Well, while we're at it, we're going to plan for recreation and we're going to plan for conservation. So what we ended up with when this plan just came out and proposed final recently was development focus areas for renewable energy and with high access to transmission to allow these impacts to be managed. And they would get a streamlined process. So not just additional hurdles to cross for being not outside of the development focus areas, but incentives if you're in them. And for instance, trying to get to quicker approval and less environmental review needed. And this plan I think was a success so far because it didn't just address what you want to protect for tortoise and what you don't. It went further and actually came across the landscape and looked at goals for recreation, conservation, renewable energy. And it was actually framed by looking at goals for conservation and energy on both state, private, and federal lands. So if you look at this plan, it was truly a landscape level plan. and they gave a lot of incentives to try to get companies to go into the right places and also to keep the state and private lands in the mix for supporting the energy. So we thought this was, a successful effort thus far. And this was tiered to the BLM's Western Solar Plan, which took a similar approach and actually designated zones for solar as well as exclusion areas. And what we've seen is recently in these zones, we've seen utility scale solar projects being approved with environmental assessment. So for those of you who have spent some time during this conference talking about the burdens of the National Environmental Policy Act, this was one way it's being addressed here. So again, reaping the benefits of landscape level conservation and also incentivizing private landowners to continue to be part of it. So far, our takeaways for some of these areas is, you can do more with a landscape level approach. In the ESA context, we tend to look at one species, but that can miss opportunities to solve other concerns and address potential future concerns, such as the 350 other species that depend on the sagebrush ecosystem. It does make it more challenging in other ways, but I think we felt that it's worth it. It can beat the alternatives of trying to address each of those kitchen sinks of issues, for instance, in grouse habitat one at a time. The other value gets more people involved because it's land. Again, instead of a species, it's land, which is what people understand and relate to very often. It's what we relate to at the Wilderness Society. It's why we've been involved in these landscape level processes, and we support these and other similar processes like Forest Service collaboratives, like the Clearwater Basin, salmon recovery, which interestingly has been happening post-listing, and issues like the Oahe Initiative. But one of the bigger things that we obviously have come to understand even better is you can't make a federal landscape level process work without the other landowners. So state, private landowners have to be at the table. And you know what? It's not their full-time job. So they need to be incentivized. And the ESA really does work here, as we've heard today, getting people to the table. But the feds can get money to the table too. Seeing the way that NRCS has worked through the SageGrouse initiative and is continuing to work in that area is really an important role if you're going to plan across a landscape level. And I think the other important thing is to provide real incentives. If we look at, for instance, the solar plans, there were real incentives to those companies in terms of streamlining projects. There are real incentives to private landowners if they know where the conservation is going to occur for the endangered and threatened species that are being looked at in that plan. So this probably came up in every single breakout group, but I'll just put it up on the slide anyway. Getting to the table early and often, bless you, and being as forthcoming as possible about what's required is important, especially as processes move forward. So keeping everybody involved, and being as clear as we can about where there's room to move and where there isn't when we're getting to solutions. In terms of policy aspects of this, there's a lot of concern, I know, for Fish and Wildlife Service about sharing information, being pre-decisional. At the same time, the more clear you can be, the less you run into this perception that we're moving the goalposts. Another area we thought that could work here was looking at some of the programmatic consultation approaches that Fish and Wildlife Service takes. They have an agreement, a longstanding agreement with the BLM and the Forest Service to do programmatic consultations. These often occur for small projects. But again, this is something we could look at if we're looking at moving forward with speedier, more efficient, more all-encompassing ESA. And the last thing, is to create and build and maintain trust. We've heard a lot about this. I really liked this picture because not only are these people really flexible and needing to trust each other, but there's all these people around them cheering them on. And I think that's something that, really is required, because no matter how much you try and no matter how much we try to address, for instance, all those kitchen sink issues in the SageGrouse plans and all the renewable issues and conservation issues in the desert plan, we're not going to address every single thing that comes up in these plans. So there has to be trust, there has to be follow-up. We've seen that already, that there are going to be some challenges with getting some more detail out to implement the grouse plans, for instance. But we know, for instance, also that NRCS is still engaging, and that will help. And we did see this trust jeopardized in some sense with the Gunnison sage-grouse, but ultimately, everyone stayed at the table. And, that's because they believe in the cause. These are people who've been working to protect the Gunnison sage-grouse, and it's bad hair for years. And, talking to the Gunnison County Commissioners, one of them loves to tell a story about his son. Anytime the parents want to go out for a run in the morning, the child is always saying, make sure you know where you're going. You can't go near the Lex too early in the day during this time of year. You're not going to walk away from that because of the listing. You're invested. This is your land. This is your community. These are your species you kind of have taken ownership for. I heard from other people saying, oh, it's cold out there. I feel like I almost should let them in the window, but they're out there frolicking about in -30 because that's what they do. So I think keeping the trust is important and acknowledging the commitment of people who are at the table and recognizing that they care. They wouldn't be there. No incentive is going to be good enough if they don't care. So overall, I think for us, we feel the landscape level planning is still better than the alternatives thus far. And, we're learning as we go and getting better at defining as much as we can and keeping the trust, and hope to see that continue.
Well, good afternoon. I'm Brett Dumas with Idaho Power, and thanks to the Western Governors for the invitation, and for Dustin for giving me that little extra motivation to get up here. It's a little daunting to be like between you guys and the bar at this time of the afternoon, but I'll try and get through it quickly. So when I started thinking about what I wanted to talk about related to landscape level conservation and private landowners, Idaho Power Company is involved in quite a few different things related to this. On the aquatic side, of course, we're heavily involved in cooperators on steelhead and salmon and bull trout and aquatic snails in the mid-snake area, lots of ESA issues. But unfortunately for you, I'm not an aquatic ecologist. I'm a terrestrial ecologist. Or as my staff calls me, I'm the political biologist. So I hope that doesn't mean I've kind of lost my field credibility, but so I've worked with a number of issues with the company over the years: northern Idaho ground squirrel, southern Idaho ground squirrel, lepidium. But I've spent probably most of my time on sage-grouse. Sometimes I say I've got sage-grouse fatigue, but I think there's people in this room who can claim that much more so than I. So how to relate private landowners and landscape level and sage-grouse to Idaho Power? I think the way that I can do that most effectively for this forum is to talk about our opportunities as a private developer and the mitigation plans that we develop in response to those. In the last presentation, Jim talked about some long power lines that are traversing a couple states. Well, some of you might have heard of Gateway West and Boardman to Hemingway. Us and our partners are trying to build 2 transmission lines across 3 states, and it gets a lot of attention, it seems. And in doing so, we have been working a long time on developing mitigation plans for those, and in particular for sage-grouse. So what I'd like to talk about is where we were when that began, how that process has gone, kind of where we're at, and my recommendation on what I'd like to see in terms of mitigation opportunities. I have been on the Idaho Sage-Grouse Advisory Committee for 10 plus years now. It advises the local supports the local working groups, advises the Office of Species Conservation and the Idaho Department of Fish and Game. I was on the governor's sage-grouse task force that helped develop the Idaho plan. But going back at the kind of the genesis of these 2 power line projects, when we were doing this planning, I came to the Sage-Grouse Advisory Committee with kind of a heads up, and I put this challenge to them. I asked them, I said, if we go forward with these projects are likely going to result in either X thousands or Y millions of dollars of mitigation. I said, standing here right now, what would you do with that money? Can you tell me where and what sage grouse need on the landscape. And to be honest, they had no idea. And I said, our challenge is that if you want to effectively help sage grouse, we've got to figure out what the answer is to those questions. So that was 2007. In 2010, the Sage Grouse Advisory Committee formed a subgroup to look at what would a mitigation framework in Idaho look like. And I was part of that. We had a diverse group of people from the BLM, the Fish and Wildlife Service, the Nature Conservancy, Idaho Conservation League, alternative energy developers. And so what I'm going to walk through a little bit of the challenge that we faced in that. And one of the initial biggest challenges, and I call it the getting past the provincial thinking, is at that time, and still even today in some cases, mitigation was thought of as required to be in kind, in place. And so I challenged them. I said, okay, well, if these power lines are having the effects that you think they are, why would we do mitigation in kind, in place? And what is that going to do to be a benefit to sage grouse, especially given the landscape level complexity of this species? So it took us a number of months, and we finally got past that hurdle where we recognized that our mitigation plan needed to do the best for the bird in the most appropriate places based on the best available science that we have. So let me jump forward to a conversation that I probably had, I don't know, more than 6 months ago over in Oregon with ODF&W. And by regulation, at least at that time, Oregon was required mitigation to be in kind, in place. Now they're working to try and change that because I think they're recognizing it as well. And fortunately, at the federal level, we're beginning to see a pretty drastic change in that philosophy. The new mitigation policy that comes out, which for the most part I think is a good policy, is recognizing that mitigation needs to be looked at regionally and in the best places. Some of the other challenges that I've seen through time has to do with what projects, what do we include? And to be honest, in both of our mitigation plans at this point in time, we have to develop that. And the way that a company develops that is, our interest is getting these projects permitted. We're not going out and doing a landscape level analysis of the projects that need to occur. I really think that needs to occur at a larger level than a company. To rely on a private company to determine the best mitigation, I don't think is in the best interest of landscape level conservation. But up to this point in time, the way that these things are usually done is that a company will go to an agency and say, what projects do you want us to put in our plan? And typically those are, let's say, pet projects of the office that they're working with, or a number of offices. And what that ends up doing is some projects that maybe don't do as much good as they otherwise could, or they end up in a lot of small postage stamp projects. And neither of those meet this need of landscape level conservation. One of the other issues that we face is this dynamic between state and federal agencies. And this is sort of, I'm not being fair to everybody because it is somewhat personality driven. The feds want mitigation on federal land. The states don't want mitigation on federal land. And here's some of the thought process behind that is the feds don't want us to go out and buy conservation easements. They want to do things on federal land. The states, and I've been told this directly by some people, is don't do anything on federal land because the feds are supposed to do that themselves. So you should do all the mitigation on state or private land. And so I came back to them after we developed some draft proposals, and a variety of different projects, conservation easements, etc. But I said, take a look at both of these plans in the direction that you're pushing us in, and they don't address the most significant threats of sage grouse at all. There is nothing in there about fire, and there's nothing in there about invasive species. And their rationale was those are too hard to quantify. How do we give you credit in this system? It's a lot easier to give you credit if you're buying a ranch for 20,000 acres and you're going to manage it and you're going to provide this kind of uplift. I said, that's really not acceptable. We have got to find a way to route these dollars to where they do the most good. And if we can't figure out a way to change the currency of mitigation so that we can do fire restoration or fire prevention or, address invasive species, then where is all this, thousands or millions of dollars going? It's going to do some interesting things, but it's not going to change the landscape. So I guess that's one of my challenges, is I think that needs to change. In terms of what I would like to see, I think that what we've developed in Idaho, the Idaho sage grouse mitigation framework, I really like it. I wish we could get over the hump and get it going. We talk about it a lot. And I use this analogy of an investor. Say I'm a small investor and I've got a few $1,000s I want to invest in. It's probably not that wise for me to go out and buy 3 stocks, right? I'm not that savvy. I don't know the risk that I'd be assuming. It makes a lot more sense for me to go out and buy a mutual fund that's managed by a professional, and all I've got to do is get them the money. My analogy is, if I'm a company, I ought not be going out and buying the right, looking at the properties to buy. I should be investing in experts who are doing that and making sure they have, what they need, the resources to do that effectively. And I think that's what we have, at least in the Idaho framework. And I know the other states around us are working on the same thing. We're talking to people in Oregon and Nevada and Colorado and Utah, and everybody's trying to develop a system that works for them. So having a state-based or a regional system, and my preference is, I think politically we've got to make it a state-based system that coordinates across state lines, that has a collaborative team oversight with advice from a science team and figures out what to do with that money is in our best interest. And whether that's a mitigation bank, a mitigation exchange, a in lieu fee program, biasly, I think for Idaho and where we're at in terms of industry and mitigation, I think an in lieu fee system makes the most sense. But what doesn't make sense is a permittee-based system of the permittee or the developer figuring out what to do. And that's still where we're at today. I think I'll leave it right there. So thank you.
Thank you, Brett. I tend to agree with those sentiments on mitigation and simply addressing the wildfire. We have a little saying around our office called "Graze it, don't blaze it." So we think we can be of assistance there. But having the privilege of going last, like Brett, I am concerned about being in front of you in the bar. More importantly, being in front of myself in the bar. So I'll try and make sure that I expedite my points, and also going last, my talking points have morphed several times, as a lot of what I intended to cover has already been covered. So I will do my best not to be redundant in that as well. So one of the things that I picked up on in one of the earlier panels, when Virgil Moore, he talked about coming from his perspective in terms of everybody has a bias. And I thought I really thought a lot about that from a perspective. Obviously, my name's Wyatt Prescott. I'm the Executive Vice President of Idaho Cattle Association. Obviously, I have a bias. I thought it would be kind of fun if everybody started their talks with what their bias exactly is. And I think mine's fairly obvious. It's of the interest of the cattle producers, which there's a grazing interest there, obviously. But I do have that bias. In fact, just not too long ago, I was in a buffet line, and a young lady behind me, when I was picking out the beef and putting on my plate, she said to me, "Oh, you wouldn't like that beef if you thought about how it was made." And I said to her, with all due respect, I wouldn't like my brother if I thought about how he was made. So obviously my bias is very easy to grasp. So incentivizing private landowner conservation. You know, when that phrase first comes across my mind, you have to think of that song, how does it go? Bring lawyers, guns, and money. But in reality, I think it can be boiled down very simplistically. I couldn't do it any better than Jim Magagna when he gave you that 4 points of regulatory certainty, clear recovery goals, financial returns, and that public land certainty. And what I want to focus on revolves more around that public land certainty, but it ultimately boils down to how to incentivize conservation on private lands. It boils down to landowner viability, the ability of that landowner to actually conduct those practices, those conservation practices. And there's a couple different ways to get at that. And first and foremost, relating back to that 4th bullet point of Jim Magagna, is that productivity of the attached federal lands and attached grazing points. I can't overstate how important it is for those permits and that public lands to remain productive and viable for the private land conservation to take place. Because as we see further restrictions on utilization, grazing, productivity on the federal lands as a result of some of these ESA related issues, private landowners, those in my industry, have no other alternative but to look to their private lands to mitigate for those losses, so to speak, that they're receiving on the public lands. Brenda touched on this as well. There is not a lot of options. And then you really start talking about serious challenges to conservation for a multitude of species. What are some of the options? Well, they're subdividing your private land. They might be building a gravel pit. There's numerous options that, regardless of your philosophies about grazing, are quite frankly, obviously, a much bigger impediment on conservation. And the second portion of that viability for these private lands conservation is this an idea that really conservation practices need to be mutually beneficial. So we need to throw away this notion of idle preservation is conservation, because it's not. It might have been 150 years ago, but it's just not anymore. We live in a different ecological conditions, and we have to manage these resources, manage these lands to enhance their productivity, at the same time provide for conservation. So those are two of those areas that I really feel like that we can build on, that viability for that producer actually to be able to take it and utilize these conservation practices. When at the first glance, I seen this panel I was going to be on, my assumption was, it was going to be conservation easement based. And I'm sure we'll get into that in some of the question answering and conversations. And there's a tool there that can be used for incentives on conservation on private lands. But in order for that tool, some of the other tools to work, such as the conservation agreements, there's got to be significant trust rebuilt amongst the landowners, amongst the agencies, amongst the NGO, the conservation groups, for it to really work. When we talk about the ESA as a motivator, there's not a doubt in my mind that it is a motivator, but unfortunately, oftentimes it's a motivator out of fear. And that can be problematic when we look to achieve more of this conservation and moving into the future. So with that, in basic summary, when I look back to the title, Landscape Level Conservation, Incentivizing Private Landowners to Do It, I think it's a title and it answers that question right there. For us, that private land conservation can be done if it's done on a landscape level, which is inclusive of mutually beneficial conservation practices and also takes into scope the productivity and the efficiency and the enhanced conservation and ecological conditions of the public lands as well. So with that, I'd be happy to sit down and help you guys get along to the bar a little bit quicker.
We can't do that quite yet, Wyatt, but we're working on it. Some time for questions. We've got some up here, you guys in the audience, and then the facilitators will need about 15 to 20 minutes to summarize what happened in those work groups, because they spent a lot of time aggregating everything up. And then Zach has some closing remarks after that. So that's kind of what we've got left. So a question, and they're kind of related. Are there advantages to this multi-species ecosystem-based conservation as opposed to single species focus? And then does the ESA in its current form allow for that to happen in both listing and recovery decisions? Anybody want to address that? I think the focus is on this is multi-species thing, a good way to go.
Yeah, so, I mean, not to be too simplistic, but I believe so. And I'll give you a more of an on-the-ground industry perspective for the idea of multi-species conservation and land management. This was out of the blue. As you know, I deal with ranchers, and sometimes they can be people of very few words. And one of my past presidents, who I don't know, I've known him several years, and he might have said 10 words total, but he was in a media interview, and he was asked a question similar along those lines. And one of the things that he said is he'd been in the genetics business, the beef genetics business, for over 30 years. And he said he quickly understood in the first year or two that when you manage genetics for single selection, single trait, that very rapidly it's at the detriment of all the other traits that you're desiring to achieve. And he correlated that back to his salmon habitat that was behind him, and the sage-grouse habitat that was in his public lands permit up on the mountain. And he quickly stated that that is the exact same with species conservation and management as well. If you manage for single species, then it's at the detriment of many other species. And his analogy in that as well, and I would agree with it, taking that into consideration, it needs to go beyond species and that human component as well. And as does the ESA limit that? Absolutely. I believe it's very narrow in focus, and it puts a lot of sideboards on being able to have that flexibility.
So my thoughts, a little bit outside of the ESA realm, given its regulatory rigidity, let's say, is let's go back, I was talking about sage-grouse mitigation. Well, I would much prefer to see that we are mitigating for sagebrush ecosystem. The challenge with that is, how do you define that? And what is expected once, okay, we can go out and measure sage-grouse. What else do we need to go study and go measure? And that gets very burdensome from our perspective of having to prove up on 10 or 15 different species instead of one. So is it possible? Is it rational to say that what we put in place for sage-grouse is going to be good for a number of different things, and that, sage-grouse is the species we're going to use to measure that? Well, I think there's some validity to that needs to be tested, though. And by doing so, I think it opens up those opportunities to do a broader set of work. So we have debated this question in our mitigation framework development group nonstop. And the challenge and complexity of adding additional species in, while ecologically makes total sense, from a regulatory, from an administrative standpoint, it's really tough to do.
I generally think that being able to plan across multiple species is going to give us more creativity, more options, and probably in the current regulatory scheme, it works more before listing. And I think there are challenges, but also, you know, this is a challenge we can rise to if we manage to get those grouse plans done, and we can keep going from there. So I do agree there are challenges in the mitigation context, especially of what counts, what needs to be mitigated, how do you calculate, but I think ultimately it's worth it if we can prevent the listing, not just the need for listing of not just the greater sage grouse, but all these other sagebrush obligate species.
This term came up from a couple of questions up here, and we're going to throw it out here to look at the responses and see where it goes. And that's the term working lands. Okay, what does it mean to each of you? It probably means different things to different people. And then how can we work to preserve what we call working lands? What are they? Do they differ from one another? And is that something that must come from the ground up? Or is it
your favorite topic?
I don't want to start all the conversations, but yeah. So I'm not a terrestrial ecologist or a biologist or any kind of ologist for that matter. I am a lobbyist and more of an ag economist than anything in my profession. But I represent a constituency that lives and works on these lands, these private and public lands. We're talking about these homes to these species, and endangered or not. And that term working lands is fully encompassing of the viability of those operators, that it's not a great picture opportunity for them or somewhere they spend 2 weekends a year. It is not only their livelihood, but it's also the means by which they produce the food that you eat every single day in many occasions. So working lands means, in my opinion, a sustainable system that produces a resource, renewable resource every single year, and produces a product that can be harvested off of that resource, but at the same time allows for the ecological benefit or for every desired species that we may have as a society. And sometimes there's winners and losers in that equation, but we have to balance this working lands to the utilitarian benefit of that landowner, that producer of food, but also to society as a whole. So it's a balanced approach. I know that seemed a little bit fluffy, but that's working lands.
Well, so, and if I take the working lands analogy and apply it to our company, the Snake River is working lands. You know, we have hydroelectric developments all throughout it, and it's what's putting these lights on right now. But that in itself isn't even enough, because we've got to get that power to you. And that means we've got to build transmission lines and distribution lines and substations. And our challenge is to figure out how to do that most effectively, recognizing the impacts that we're having and how to mitigate for those. Now, I'll be quite honest, you know, when they built those dams and those power lines, those original ones 50, 60 years ago, that probably wasn't at the forethought of their mind. They were just trying to get from point A to point B and provide power, you know. It was very utilitarian driven. Nowadays, even on those systems, we have done amazing advancements in changing how we manage and site and operate those things to try and recognize that we need, even on working lands, we need to provide for these other interests and values and resources at the same time, as well as we can.
I think in a broader perspective for me, you know, that if we're looking at it from the private land owner, then what the land works for also depends on the landowner. We have landowners who are doing grazing or farming. We also have landowners who are looking at giving conservation easement on land where the use is their enjoyment. And so I think lands can work in a lot of different ways. And so to me, the working lands are really going to be more from the ground up, as you suggested, of what's happening on them right now that we need to preserve, and how can that continue.
I got this, decided I'm going to take this back to campus and start walking around talking about we need to be a working university and see what happens. Yes, I'm sure. Questions from the audience. let's take the rest of the time asking getting your questions out. It looks like we got one right away. Okay.
I'm Ed Arnett. I'm the senior scientist with the Theodore Roosevelt Conservation Partnership. I also was a participant and panelist at the Cody meeting, so I wanted to take the platform to just express my appreciation to the panelists in the session. I thought it was very good and helped build off of some of the things that we did there. A comment that I wanted to share, and it's a clarification from my discussion earlier with Brenda Richards on EQIP and its use on public lands. As I understand it, that actually is the one program in the Farm Bill that can actually transcend to public lands. But there's some misinformation out there clearly in my conversation with Brenda about that. So there's probably some opportunities to look into the use of EQIP dollars for individual operations on both public and private. I was also told that part of the reason that a lot of landowners don't use EQIP or apply, the leasee actually has to apply for the EQIP application. It can't be my organization or the other government agency or something else, but it's very complex and very bureaucratic. So there's probably an opportunity there, and also an opportunity to look at the communication issues from the ground level, the people that say you can't do it when obviously you can. It transcends into another question that you brought up, Brett, about conflicting policies. You noted that Oregon is required to mitigate in-kind in plays. I guess from the panelist perspectives, and this could go for any of the panelists really, one of the issues I see are conflicting policies to implement or to impede our ability to succeed. You named one. Can you guys maybe generate some ideas on some other specific policies? I can think of a few. I'm not even going to bring them up, but what would impede our ability to really be successful, not only with the ESA, but just species conservation and all the things that we've been talking about in this session?
Well, I can start with I think that's a good point. And I've seen it, we've looked at the example in Wyoming on the grouse where the state and the feds really work together and they have a cohesive plan for managing a lot of activities. I think from the Colorado perspective, we have yet to, for instance, align the way that we handle oil and gas leasing and development on state lands and how we manage it to the extent we can on private land with the way the federal plans are set up. And I think where we have interspersed ownership, we do need to come up with a better way to coordinate. Otherwise, it is not going to be as successful. Especially, I think that will extend to other states as well. We have a lot of checkerboard, and that will be a challenge.
Anybody else? You don't have to say anything.
I'm thinking really hard because I know there's examples out there. I see it less in Idaho than I do in Oregon. Oregon has quite a bit more state regulation than Idaho does. And at least at the processes that we go through, there's a lot of conflict between federal processes such as NEPA and state-based processes that my challenge is to think of a more specific one related to, species and landscape conservation, other than, clearly this issue of how mitigation is dealt with is a real problem. And one of the areas in California is a poster child for that. So talking with utilities down in that area, it's not uncommon for them to have to mitigate separately between the feds and the state. We call it pancaking. And, it ends up costing them and their ratepayers millions and millions of dollars because you can't get the two parties to sync, their goals, their interests, and their regulations. So it's really problematic. Fortunately, I think we see less of that in Idaho.
Yeah, so I would agree with that, Brett. But I don't know if I can address exactly the conflicting between the state and federal policies, but a major challenge is the layers within the federal policies for us. And then there is another conflict that I think I caution to even bring it up this late in the day, but that is the conflict that ensuing litigation causes for our ability for species conservation. And of course, an element of that is driven by, it can be a lucrative proposition through equal access to justice and et cetera. So.
Okay. You have another question?
Sure. It's Jay Tatchton with Defenders of Wildlife. I think mainly for Nada, but for the rest of you as well. A lot of these collaborative processes view ESA listing or litigation as a failure of the collaborative process. It seemed both occurred in the Gunnison SageGrouse situation, where you had a listing, you had litigation by both sides. I'm just wondering what your secret was to keep all the various parties still talking, despite what sometimes gets everyone to take their ball and go home.
I think there was some extended initial pouting, it's fair to say. So I think it was hard to recover from, and the initial expectation was that people would take their balls and go home. But I also think there was actually a lot of looking at the greater sage-grouse plan and thinking, well, if we could get the BLM to do a plan like that here, maybe that helps us get to where we think we need to be. Also, that there was a very strong commitment across this 11-county coalition to conserve the Gunnison sage-grouse. So they just didn't quite walk away, and they continue to believe there's a chance to develop a plan, a state plan and a federal plan that will still work. So I think that's what's kept everyone at the table. It's not helping, just to be clear, I don't think, but they all see a way forward.
Another question from anybody? Are we getting tired? I can understand that. Well, what we've got then is, why don't we just use the natural curve of we're done with this panel. We had one less panelist, which probably would have kept the conversation maybe going a little bit longer, but